Hello everyone, this is Tyler here, and I'm going to discuss here why age gaps make a huge impact in the dating and relationship environment of countries, and how it often is a big determining factor if a country is more MGTOW or less MGTOW. Okay, I've spoken about age gaps, and in certain countries, in certain regions of the world, it is much more common than others, and it's very interesting. In all the countries I've traveled and lived, and I've kind of witnessed where it's more common and where it's less common. Firstly, the country that I've traveled to or lived where I think it was the most common was Russia. The country where it's been least acceptable, I believe, would be here in Estonia or possibly Slovakia. It's very interesting how countries deem it as more acceptable, and also if it's even potentially a good option, if there's even enough availability of single ladies. I understand here that obviously we're MGTOW guys and gals. Most of us are not seeking long-term relationships or wives, but there are some that do indeed seek that. And so I think it's good to note that. When we look though at like the age gap situation in a lot of places, in more recent times, I think overall it's became less accepted by society. And when I say recent times, I'm talking about decades here, generations. I'm not talking about, say, the past 10 years, past 20 years. I mean long term, compared, say, to like the 1850s, for example. If we go back many decades ago, even centuries ago, it was very accepted and it was very commonly practiced in many countries around the world. In fact, most countries, I think, it was more common than very small age gaps among populations. And I also believe that it's very indicative of a more naturally hypergamous environment that's more based on natural biology and biological factors, more so than on like societal factors. In the places I've lived where it's less acceptable, what I see is often it's more of a societal construct why it's not so common, or why there's not a lot of it seen. Absolutely. In recent times, probably in the last few years especially, there has been a reversal in some countries with this mindset. It's important though to note that most guys, there's a lot of guys in the manosphere, and they discuss the prevalence of age gaps. There is certainly a class of guys who are in their 40s, maybe even 50s, that can reasonably date like 20 years younger or even more. But for the most part, it's pretty tough in a lot of countries, apart from in Southeast Asia. I think in terms of age gaps, anywhere between 10 to 15 years would be like maximum for a typical guy in most places. Yes, there are cases where you could go beyond that, but often when it's beyond that point, it's really a matter of being like short-term flings in most cases. It's very difficult to find gals that are, say, in their early 20s that are interested being with like a 50-year-old guy for a long-term relationship, or even short-term. Often it's just like a fling or something. They're not often looking at them seriously as like a long-term relationship, and it's very important to note that, because I think also some girls assume that all guys that are, say, like 50 or 40 are just interested in a short-term fling, and indeed look at this opportunity as a real relationship, but then realize that that's not possible with the kind of gal that they're attracting. And this is actually a common issue that Bruce V, very famous PUA guy, he spoke about this. This was becoming exceptionally difficult for him when he was living in Poland and in Eastern Europe as a whole, as his age was getting higher and higher, late 30s especially. He noticed that to find gals for even a longer term relationship was becoming more difficult, and nowhere near to the ideal of marriage, which is something I know he was seeking eventually, but it was quite difficult due to the age was gradually becoming bigger and bigger, and he was still shooting for girls that were basically the same age as the ones he first started dating 10 years prior to that point that he went to Eastern Europe. This is just a trend. It's important to note also, like the Soviet history in Eastern Europe. Many people don't realize this, that during the Soviet Union, most relationships and marriages were not very big age gaps. Apart from perhaps like the upper echelons of society, this wasn't as common, I think, as people assume. Now, once the Soviet Union fell, this is where the age gap started becoming bigger, and it was becoming more common in some of the Eastern European countries, but not all of them. And it's very interesting, as some of the Central and Eastern European countries moved away from communism and started to adopt more of this Western system, similar to the US or Canada, it started becoming less common in places like Slovakia, as an example, here in Estonia, among other places. And these are countries where, yeah, there are absolutely cases of age gaps existing, but it's not so common, and chances are it's usually mostly domestic-based people. If you're, say, like a foreign person, go to one of these countries, like here in Estonia, it's really extreme. Even if you're, say, more than 5 years older than a gal, it can be very difficult. And that's why you got to be very careful when you choose a country. Even over in Russia or Ukraine, it's really changing rapidly there. For many guys, it's not as easy as it may seem, especially over in Moscow, the capital. That's one of the biggest cities in Europe. That is no easy place for relationships. And if you're a guy over 40, you're going to have some serious change if you go there. The standards are very high for foreign guys, and they would actually be quite on par to like a Western country in Moscow. That not the whole country of Russia, just in the capital. So keep in mind that yes, it can work, but societally speaking, you also have to remember here that a lot of these countries, there's not a large number of younger women that are on the dating market or that are interested in dating at all. It's probably actually more common in a country like here in Estonia or in Slovakia perhaps to find a girl that's basically being shared by multiple guys than vice versa. Whereas like you go over to Russia, it's probably the opposite. It's vice versa. And that's why usually, in most cases, you should shoot for the bigger countries. There's probably going to be a larger pool of younger women that are single. There's more rotation, and I think it's more meritocratic. It's very much a place where often you get what basically you reflect. If you're a very solid, top quality guy, you'll probably find some very suitable women to go out with and possibly for a relationship. And unfortunately though, smaller countries, Central, Eastern Europe, more difficult, and especially as you get older. I myself am 28 now. You'd be surprised, even for me, say today, like a 20-year-old here in Estonia, it's very difficult. Whereas I go over to Russia, very easy. It's just a different mindset. I think here it's more akin to like England, whereas the mindset in England, for example, just like in Canada, is very much it's small age gaps with relationships, and there's this social stigma for some reason. Even an age gap of like 8 years is seen as massive for some reason in place like England or in Canada, which it really isn't. In looking at natural hypergamy, it especially isn't. Obviously. Now, if you go over though, if you're an older man, if you're like 40s plus, and you really want like a serious relationship, you may be better off going to Southeast Asia. I think Southeast Asia is one of the only true countries where age gaps are extremely acceptable. And I've read and I've seen in videos, there's many older men, like 40, 50 plus, and you go all the way up to like 70s. These guys can go there and find young women in their 20s, possibly 30s, that are with guys that are several decades older than them. And some of the guys actually do find like legitimate women, and they even get married, or they have long-term relationships. Philippines is an example of this. You see many guys, they can find legitimately a wife and live there long-term. This is very common, obviously, in Southeast Asia. In most of that part of the world, at least with foreign guys and domestic women, it's very acceptable. And I think financially speaking, you bring something to the table, you'll get a fair amount of respect from the women. But unfortunately, I think you don't bring this kind of, I don't think it's seen as much like this, say, in Eastern Europe. And also remember that much more competition also for these women. It's not like maybe how it was 25 years ago in a lot of these countries. There's a lot more guys, and I've said this before, older guys now, foreign guys aren't just competing against older foreign guys, they're competing against a lot of younger foreign guys, and they will be competing against more of them as more younger guys are leaving Western countries like the US and Canada, coming to Eastern Europe to live. And so you have a whole market of guys that will be entering these countries. And unlike, say, like 20 or 25 years ago, it was a very particular kind of guy that typically came here at a young age. Whereas now, because of how economics and how the whole country or how the West has became, you're seeing all kinds of guys that are moving to these countries. So the competition is really going up in some of these countries. And also remember that domestically speaking, the interest in some of the places is going down in being with a foreign guy in a long-term relationship. In some of these places, I think there's kind of a revitalization in the dating market, local domestic dating markets, where women will just prefer to date and marry guys in their own countries, and you have to remember that. Now, in Latin America, this can go both ways. When I lived in Chile, big age gaps, not very common. They did exist. I actually knew of a very famous account. I had a friend, and the friend, it was his sister. This friend was he was from Argentina, from Mendoza. His sister, she was kind of working as a model at the time. She was Argentine. This was like 6 years ago. She actually had an official relationship with what was the brother of the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, he was the former president of Chile. He's actually a billionaire. The guy, it was his brother. He was in a relationship with this girl. I also knew her. She also had another guy on the side that basically she ended up having a child with the other guy. The other guy, both of the guys were a lot older than her. Her official boyfriend was like 25 years older. The guy that she had the child with, I believe, was around 15 years old. So that was an example where I saw this in South America. But keep in mind, she was Argentine, and it's much more common, I think, in Argentina than in Chile. Whereas in Chile, it's not so acceptable. And in South America, it really varies. If you're in Colombia, Venezuela, yes, it's probably much more acceptable. In those countries, I think it goes both ways. But it certainly has also become a lot more challenging in South America as a whole. It's not like it was, say, 20 or 25 years ago. The times have really changed rapidly. And also keep in mind, we have all the entertainment and social agendas that have been pushed worldwide via like internet, and people now can see everything constantly that's happening in the West, media and everything, entertainment. It's also the fact that you have the competition aspect. You have the dating apps. That was another big issue, obviously. Over in Eastern Europe, you didn't have dating apps 15 years ago, 20 years ago. They weren't very it's same thing in Southeast Asia and in Latin America also. So like in Latin America, this was probably, of all of these countries, that region was the most social part of the world for quite some time. The social circles were the largest for the common person. So people, they obviously had their social circle, but now they also have online dating, which makes it even more difficult now for your average guy. And for this reason, along with other reasons, many guys like in Brazil, in Chile, even in like Mexico, Costa Rica, it's not like it used to be. Age gaps, though, like in South America, yeah, it can work. I think it really depends on the guy in these places. Probably more acceptable in places like Brazil, in Argentina, Colombia, in somewhere like Chile, more difficult, of course. What you'll notice often, there's a common trend here, is that smaller countries tends to be less viable than bigger countries. Real big countries, there's something that makes it, I think, more viable for an average guy. In bigger countries, it seems to be something that's more possible for an average guy. And that's important to note here. So if you're a guy and you want to have a long-term relationship, you should probably look at a bigger country. It may not be as comfortable for living, but there'll probably be a more fluid dating and relationship market, more rotation, more younger women that are probably going to be more driven by natural hypergamy. I'm not saying hypergamy doesn't exist in the smaller countries. It's just there's not as much fluctuation, there's not as much fluidity. And remember that small place, people obviously have a lot of contact with the community around them. It takes pretty quickly for people to know if a girl's with kind of moving from guy to guy, being passed around, or certainly with a foreign guy, and a foreign guy that's a lot older. There obviously could be a lot of social stigma there. Whereas bigger country, this type of stuff is easier to conceal. An average woman, just like an average guy, could very easily have been with 10 or 15 different guys, and no one may ever know about. And really, I don't think an age gap is a big deal. I don't think people need to make a big deal about it. Unfortunately, you as a guy only have part of the control here. The other part, obviously, you don't have control over. You may be in a society or with a woman where they put a lot of focus on that and they make a big production about that, which I think is ridiculous, but this certainly is the case in some places. And you have to be realistic at the end of the day, because you go to a place like a small country, it's not very acceptable. It could be really challenging. You won't probably find what you're looking for. You have to look at the statistics here. That's the most important thing to understand. Also, remember what I said before. The spectrum of person in smaller to bigger countries, a much bigger spectrum in bigger countries. You don't have the same kind of variation in the smaller countries. So like there's often a preferred type of guy, just like a few preferred types of guys in small countries. If you don't fit that classification as a foreign guy, will have very little success in most cases. And whereas in bigger countries, there's going to be a lot more spectrum of taste and desires among women. You'll find a larger pool that would be interested, like anything, it's really something you have to approach on a individual basis and go to a place. If it doesn't work, go to a different place. If that doesn't work, go to a different place. And eventually you'll find a country where you'll obtain what you're looking for and you can carry out a long-term relationship if that's how you are. It's always important, see how it is in the first 6 months. If it's not very good, it's probably not going to improve and get better, and you probably should consider a different place. That's rule of thumb I always tell people. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.